Hi everyone, and welcome to this week 4 lecture.
So this week we are talking about microsociology. So if you wanted to study a phenomenon at the population level, for example, the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the ageing population in Australia, you would be involved in a macro level study. Macrosociology looks at large social structures and systems, for example, at the population level of a country or even of the world. But if you wanted to understand the impact of the coronavirus on relationships in families where a member of the family or members of the family were in that vulnerable demographics, have the aging population or people who have respiratory conditions like asthma or some other sort of underlying health conditions, and you had a sample of 200 families, you'd be involved in microsociology. These are very complementary ways of doing sociology, as sociology is all about understanding how those large-scale structures and institutions sort of shape the lives of people at the individual and group level. So at what level you're doing sociology will certainly have an impact on the questions you ask and the methods that you use. At that level of microsociology, what we're looking at mostly is studies of interactions between individuals and small groups, a lot of the time face-to-face, but not exclusively. For example, you might ask how colonisation has affected the character of Australian society. That's a macro level question. But if you wanted to ask about why girls often lose their interest in sport during high school, then that's a micro level question. And that will have the implications for that question, maybe that there'll be stuff happening at that large social level on gender, etc., that impacts on the lives of girls in high schools. What we're interested in doing at that micro level is asking questions that are local and focused to examine the lives of small groups of people. So macro sociologists, those who are studying those large social structures, typically use a combination of methods. For example, they'll look at historical and archival research, statistical analysis over a long period of time to show how social structures do evolve over time as well. A microsociologist typically use research methods that involve direct interaction with research participants. So that's interviews, focus groups, and participant observation. What I'm going to be doing today is going through each of those, but before I want to get there, I do want to talk about how you're going to get a small group of people together. So I'm going to go through, briefly touch on the idea of setting up a research question, and that's really quite important because you don't want to ask a large macro level question, you want to ask a question that's local and focused, as I said, to examine small groups of people. So I'm going to go through very briefly through the research question, then I'm going to go through sampling, because you have to work out a way of contacting that small group of people that you're going to be interviewing or examining the interactions of, and then I'll end up looking at interviews, focus groups, and participant observation.
When it comes to a research question, a few things to think about: that your research question does need to be limited in scope because we can't do everything, and we certainly can't do everything at once. So we usually do small projects with very clear boundaries around the topic. I'll give an example of that in a minute. You are examining observable and tangible things. You'll usually have open questions: what, why, and how. And an example of an open question there is, what is the experience of university students compelled to take classes online? And I'm thinking during the COVID-19 pandemic, many students thought that they were going to be studying in classes, and they were, because of lockdown and things like that, they weren't able to do that. That's a very broad topic at the moment. It's not very limited in scope. Are we talking about Australian university students across the world? Are we talking about first year students, second year students, third year students? The experience of first year students, for example, might be very different to third year students. So you need to work out some boundaries around that topic and make it much more manageable, much more limited in scope than that. You might also want to know how, this is another one of those open questions, how students interact with class material online and on campus, and the variations between the two. And you might also want to find out why some students prefer online to on campus, if you know that for a fact already, which because I've had conversations with students, I do know that some students prefer online to on campus and others prefer on campus to online. You need to also read widely and identify some gaps in the literature. I imagine that there'll be lots of literature coming up about projects around the pandemic, and it might be about students being compelled to take classes online. Might be a part of that, so that wouldn't be a gap in the literature. But you don't want to be replicating what everybody else has done. So you need to have a look and see what other studies have been done around university students, different levels of university students in different countries, and see whether this is a project that people haven't yet taken up. Also consider if you're doing exploratory, explanatory or descriptive research, and use a research proposal or ethics application to work out the details. This is something that Johnny Saldana talks about, and I absolutely endorse wholeheartedly, because by the time you get to the end of a very lengthy ethics application, because you're doing human research, you know exactly what it is that you're going to do. You have to be very clear about that, clear about the question, clear about the gaps in the literature, clear about the process of contacting people and recruiting them, clear about the sort of questions that you're going to be asking. So research proposals and ethics applications are wonderful for working out the details. Once you've done that, it might feel a bit tedious at the beginning, but once you've done it, you just get on with your research project. Sampling simply means the process of selecting who or which groups we are going to observe. Probability sampling, I should say that the main difference between non-probability and probability sampling is that non-probability sampling does not involve random selection, and probability sampling does. It doesn't mean that non-probability samples aren't representative of the population, not necessarily, but it does mean that non-probability samples cannot depend on the rationale of probability theory. At least where you're using a probabilistic sample, we know the odds or probability that we have represented the population well, and therefore you can generalize from a small sample to the whole population. That's more associated with doing quantitative research than it is with doing qualitative research. Usually with qualitative research we're doing non-probability sampling, and we can't generalize to an entire population. The sorts of sampling that we usually do are convenience, purposive, snowball, quota and self-selected sampling, and I'll go through those in a bit more detail. Convenience sampling is also known as accidental, haphazard and reliance on available subjects. You know those, when you see journalists on the news asking questions of people on the street, they've just walked down Rundle Mall for example and asked random people questions. That's known as a vox pop. That's also convenience sampling. Using students in your classes, psychologists are famous for using psychology students. Again, that's convenience sampling. The students are just there. If you were doing some medical research and you decided to choose a particular clinic and talk to people in that clinic, then again that's a convenient sample as well. Great for doing pilot studies, perhaps for practicing your research skills, and exploratory studies as well. It's certainly quick and it's cheap, and it's absolutely not generalizable.
Purposive sample is also known as judgmental sampling. So you're targeted towards a particular intended group. So you select a group based on knowledge about that population. So you might want members of a particular political party, for example. So you might want to go and talk to people who are members of the Greens, or perhaps if you're studying people on the right, then members of particular sort of neo-Nazi parties, for example, members of sporting clubs. So you're targeting particular groups. Somebody mentioned that often what we want to do is target sort of what are called deviant groups, when I'm just problematizing that word deviant, but people, for example, who don't go to clubs, who don't go to parties, so people who don't conform perhaps to the majority, or people who didn't panic buy during the COVID-19 panic. Within purposive sampling, which as I said, you're targeting particular groups, there would also be subcategories as well, such as modal instant sampling. In statistics, the mode is the most frequently occurring value in a distribution, and in sampling, when we do a modal instant sample, we are sampling the most frequent case or the typical case. obviously there's problems with this because we don't always know what typical means. And then you might have expert sampling. So you might have particular people who work with a group of people. So my example there is professionals who work with a group of people who are known as at risk. Again, I'm problematizing that word at risk, young people, and so you might want to talk to those particular experts because they have expertise in working with that group. So that's subcategories, purposive sampling, where you're targeting particular groups of people to speak with. Then the next type of sampling is snowball sampling. I've already mentioned this, I think. So most of my research, I think, would be purposive and then snowballing. So I would target particular populations of people and then ask them to pass on details of the study, if they can, to other people. I mentioned two large studies that I did that resulted in books. One a long time ago on the Christian Science Church. So I used purposive sampling there, where I targeted people in the community, and then those people passed on my details to people that they thought might be interested in the research sampling. So by the time that I got to meet them, you know, it'd been passed on many times. It's also known as chain referral. So you're asking people who know people to pass on details. Next up is quota sampling, and there are two examples there. One is proportional quota sampling. So if you know that in your population group there's 40% male, 59% female, 1% trans, then what you do is sample until you've got a sample of 40% male, 59% female, 1% trans. So if you've already got, for example, the 40 males for your sample but not met the others, then you continue to sample until you get the 59% female and 1% trans. So that means that even if other people come forward, say more males come forward, you wouldn't include them in your sample because you've already met your target. Non-proportional quota sampling is less restrictive. You're probably just going to specify how many of each group that you want in your sample. So if you're looking at people, the range of political spectrum from radicals through to conservatives, then you would say I'd have 10 radical people and 10 conservatives and 10 small L liberals, or people more in the middle. It's less restrictive, but you still kind of get a group of people that might be sort of representative population. Self-selective sampling, I'm sure that you've probably seen either on social media, or sometimes you might still see notices on the back of toilet doors at the university where researchers are inviting you to participate in a sample, and then they ask you to just take a little piece of paper with a phone number or an email details on it, and therefore you're opting in. You see that advertisement and choose to participate. When we're sampling, I guess I wanted to just point out that we may have some sort of bias, and we might be aware of that bias, but it might be also an unconscious bias. So this is a quote from one of our Australian human rights commissioners. What we call unconscious bias is unavoidable. So we normally do a whole lot of categorization of our information. We routinely sort objects and people into groups to help us make decisions. He says it's a product of biology and the way our brains work. We associate people who may look or sound a particular way with certain things, and that might be good and that might be bad. These are associations that are activated without us being aware. He points to social psychologists and says that they've demonstrated that we all make implicit assumptions, including about ethnic or racial groups, even if we consciously think we reject a group's stereotypes. So we might think that we're not racist, for example, but we might still be carrying some sort of bias in our minds without being aware of it. Studies demonstrate there are often massive differences between our conscious and our unconscious biases. I raise that point from the Australian Human Rights Commissioner because he's talking there about the absence, for example, of Asian Australians running businesses and in politics, so at the kind of the top level of Australian society. I wanted to raise it here because I think it's an important point when we are doing our sampling. We need to make sure that we are conscious of our biases, but also trying to avoid those unconscious biases as well. So if you're kind of doing one of those vox pops around the place and you see somebody who's quite a big burly man with lots of tats, you might feel a bit afraid of that person because they look intimidating, but that could be an unconscious bias that you have. So we need to be aware of that because it may well affect our sampling. The other point that I wanted to bring up is a point that's made by Howard Becker, who reckons that we should doubt everything anyone in power tells us. And just to read this quote for anybody who's listening rather than reading, he says that institutions always put their best foot forward in public. The people who run them, being responsible for their activities and reputation, always lie a little bit, smooth over rough spots, hiding troubles, denying the existence of problems. What they say may be true, but social organisation gives them reasons to lie. A well-socialised participant in society may believe them, but a well-socialised social scientist will suspect the worst and look for it. So what he's suggesting there is that we don't always rely on people in the highest level of an organisation, because they will think that they have a unique insight into what's going on. You know, those superordinates, the people in charge, think they know more about what's going on in an organisation than subordinates do. For example, you might end up with school principals making some decisions about how you want to do your studies. So they might want you to focus, for example, on problem students rather than on the institution or the way that the teachers work, or indeed how the school principals get things organised in an organisation. So that's what he calls this hierarchy of credibility, that some people do have more credibility in the community, but really what we need to do is have a hermeneutic of suspicion towards them. Just don't take what they say at face value and look for a wider group of people to speak with. So another point that Howard Becker makes is what he calls the corollary, or what follows from the hierarchy of credibility, is that some people or organisations aren't considered worth studying at all. And he talks about a study in the 1970s in America where only the best or the Ivy League medical schools were studied. And when Becker wanted to go outside of that group, he wanted to go and have a look at the University of Kansas, the value of his project was queried. That whole approach rested on a couple of assumptions, one being that there really was a difference in quality, yet at the time, back in the 1950s or 60s, no one had demonstrated that there actually was a difference in quality of education, and there'd actually only been one study that showed that after 5 years as a medical profession, the really big thing was not school you'd come from, but what work, or where you went to work afterwards. So this particular study found that if you're working in a big hospital where there were lots of people who could see what you were doing, so there's lots of accountability in effect, then doctors tended to rate very highly on quality. But doctors who practiced alone, for example, in a rural setting in their own practice, rated quite low on quality. So it wasn't so much about those Ivy League medical schools at all. So what he says is that our sampling choice offended an uninspected credo which held that when you studied one of the major social institutions, you studied a really good one. And he's problematizing good there so that you could see what made it good. That would make it possible then for other institutions of that type to adopt the practices you had detected, and that would raise the standard of that segment of the organisational world. So what he's suggesting there is that we be reflexive, that we do think about why we're choosing particular groups and whether we've got some unexamined ideas about groups of people or organisations that we should be examining. Now we'll move on to the different types of methods that you're going to be using at a micro level. And interviewing for some people is definitely described as the hallmark of qualitative research, although I did notice that in the readings for this week that some people consider participant observation as a hallmark anyway. If you are doing participant observation, chances are you're going to be doing some sort of interviewing. You will have already done lots of interviews or been on the receiving end, been interviewed in everyday life. There's lots of informal conversations when you ask somebody how they went at a particular exam or how their weekend was. You're kind of doing a bit of an interview, even though it's a very informal one. When you go along to see a doctor, the doctor is interviewing. Journalists, of course, are interviewing all the time. If you're wanting immigration status in Australia, then you're going to go for an interview, and same for a job. You've probably already been for job interviews. There are television interviews, there's therapeutic interviews, so if you go along to a group or speak to a counsellor, then that's the type of interview as well. Researchers are often using their interview material both as a resource and as an interview topic. So interviews are analysed both for what interviewees have to say about their lives and experiences, and that's where we're using the interview as a resource. But interviews can also be examined for how people communicate and what they're actually talking about and how they're telling the stories. So that's an interview as a topic. So interviewing allows a researcher to obtain really rich, very, very detailed data about how people view and experience their worlds. It's also incredibly flexible because you can do it over the phone, you could do it via Skype or Zoom, FaceTime, you can meet people in a coffee shop, etc. So you can make it work for both parties, the researcher and the other person. But it also can be a little bit unpredictable and time consuming. So in terms of unpredictables, perhaps somebody will want to bow out. The conversation won't go in the direction that you were hoping for the material, and it's certainly time consuming. Depending on how many interviews you're doing, interviews will typically take anywhere from 60 minutes to 90 minutes, perhaps a little bit longer, and depending on the project you might want to go back and talk to that person a second or a third time. So it takes up a lot of time, which reminds me of that podcast from week 1 where they were talking about the time involved in qualitative research versus quantitative research. So if you want to get projects over and done with really quickly, then go for the quant ones. Researchers are often using material, as I said before, both as a resource and as a topic. And then they're analysed for what interviewees say about their lives, as well as how the information is communicated. Why would we go through all of that time? Interviews are definitely one of my favourite research methods because we do achieve a level of depth and complexity that's not available, particularly if we're using survey-based approaches. So we get access to people's experiences, what they believe, their values. We get to understand them, basically. As I said, it has flexibility. You also get to explore some views that people might not be comfortable talking about. You get to go behind the scenes a little bit. I'm thinking there of perhaps, you do want to understand why people join neo-Nazi groups. So that's going to be not a particularly popular group. Some of those might choose to hide, some of them won't. But any sort of suppressed view gives you an opportunity to get to know why somebody believes things the way that they do. Same with sensitive topics. You're able to talk about sensitive issues like sexuality, etc., in private and in great deal of detail. So the complexity of human life is what I love about why I do. So to be good at interviewing, you really do need to have a genuine interest in people because you're kind of getting up close and personal with them, and people do know if you're not very interested. They pick up that vibe and they'll close off, which is fair enough. In terms of skills, you need to be able to set aside your personal judgments and criticisms because, again, people will pick up on that. They'll be less open if they think that you are being judgmental, and that's a skill in and of itself. And it's also a good idea perhaps to practice that as well. I noticed that in some of the very early interviews that I did when I listened back to the recordings, that sometimes I would be showing some surprise. I don't think so much criticism, but certainly some surprise, I guess, at some things that people were saying, and I've had to learn to monitor that quite a bit and put that aside. When it comes to question framing, you do need to be careful about how you frame your questions. It's open questions that we need. There are definitely people who, it doesn't matter how you frame a question, whether it's what we call closed or open, they will respond anyway. And at the other end of the spectrum, there'll be people where it doesn't matter how open your question is, they might not be very forthcoming. But generally, if you have a closed question, it's kind of a do or an is question, begins with do or is, and the response might be yes or no. So did you have a good weekend? Yes, for example. Whereas if you have an open question beginning with how or why or what, that allows people to elaborate a whole lot more. When it comes to listening, there's this idea about active listening where you really want to tune in to what somebody is saying, not just hear the words, but pay really close attention to how they're saying things with the particular words they're using, but also with their body language as well. So you're being attentive and asking for a little bit more below the surface of what they're saying. So don't necessarily accept the first comment on something. You might want to ask, how did you feel about that? Tell me a little bit more about that. So, very gently probing for a little bit more elaboration. Remember that you're not a journalist, so you don't want to go hard in on some of these things. When it comes to logistics and planning, you've got to do that sampling that I talked about before. Who is it that you want information from? Why are you interviewing? How many people? How many times? Sometimes you might just interview somebody once. It might be more appropriate, however, to interview somebody a couple of times. When do you know when to stop when doing an interview? For me, it kind of works to think about saturation. I remember when I first set out on this research journey, that I'd often let people talk for a very long period of time, and then I'd have to transcribe it all. So I got a little bit more skilled about not letting conversations go on and ramble on for too long. I also got very skilled at knowing when it kind of was reached a point of what I called kind of emptiness, where we'd said enough on the topic and it was finished. The other point of saturation that I noticed is sometimes people get overwhelmed by feelings. I remember in one interview, I was talking with somebody about their foster care experience, and there was so much sadness in the room that after about 60 minutes, I did say to the woman, do you want to stop now? And she said, yes. If you hadn't asked me, I would have said to you that I really need to stop now. So attend to what's going on in the room and your own intuition. In terms of what information would be valuable, what you ask, that's going to depend on your research project. It often helps to have some sort of guide, an interview guide that you've set up beforehand with at least some notes of things that you want to interview people on. When it comes to recording, your options are to video record, to audio record, to make notes. All of those have advantages and disadvantages. Somebody might not want to be video recorded. I usually do audio recordings. I would rarely make notes while I'm interviewing somebody because of the disruption that I notice that if I'm taking a note, I'm not listening to what the person is actually saying. Also need to think about who you are and whether that will present a barrier. So university academic might be seen as experts in a field, and therefore people could be wanting to please you, or they might think you're a wanker really. So they might not be interested in even being interviewed by you. So you've got to think about yourself in relationship to the people that you're interviewing as well. Support strategies for people, you might need to think about that as well. Talked last week about the foster care project. I needed to have lots of support strategies in place for people because I knew there was a very strong likelihood that I'd be interviewing people who had been quite traumatised and brutalised as children. Support strategies might be ringing people after the interview to make sure they're okay, providing them with a list of organisations that they can go to, for example, like Lifeline. Checking in with them to see whether they have support when they go home and somebody they can talk to about it. Analysing the interview, we'll cover this in later weeks. I'll kind of leave it there, but that might be something that you're thinking about early on as well. As I said, there are different types of questions, open questions and closed questions. There's also introductory questions. So you'd explain the purpose of the interview, ensure that they understand, see if they're still interested in it, and all of those questions will be closed questions. So do you understand what we're doing today? Are you still okay with going ahead with it, for example? So you start off there, then you'll have your key questions, which will be about the interview topic itself. And as I said, you might have a guide to some things that you want to cover if you're doing a semi-structured interview. And then you'll go a little bit deeper and ask a little bit more. So if somebody's talking about the topic and you think that they haven't said everything that there is, then you might well ask them how that made them feel, what it was like for them, even tell me a little bit more about that, so that they can go on. And then summing up questions, for example, is there anything else you'd like to say? Again, that's more of a closed question. You might want to cover some of do a summary of some of the things that they've talked about. But so very often I find that I'm using closed questions at the beginning and at the end, and open questions in the middle. And as I said, you might want to have an interview guide if you're doing what's called a semi-structured interview, where it's fairly loose and you allow people to talk on the topic fairly widely, so you're not strict about your questions. So it might be more about themes that you have there. So you'd have something in front of you to remind you that you've covered everything that you want to cover. Things to avoid when you're writing questions is to try and avoid jargon, so keep the wording appropriate for the interview. So by jargon, I mean that might be sort of business place language that's very familiar to everybody in the business or the workplace, but not familiar to anybody outside of it. Double-barreled questions are really difficult to respond to, and something that I have to train myself out of still. I've still got a bit of habit of these. For example, have you and your partner ever considered separating? That's one question. Or going to see a counsellor is another question. And what happens is in a person's mind is that they've got two questions there and they don't really know which one to go for. And you might be really quick-witted and you start to see something and see something else and you're asking all of these questions. That's fine for you. That's actually not very good for the person on the receiving end of that. So just try to ask one question at a time, maybe jot down a note to follow up on some of the others. If questions are too vague, then that's very hard for people to respond to as well, so you're likely to get a vague response. So if you ask a question like, what services do older people need in this area, that's pretty vague. What do you mean by services? Are you thinking of particular services just for older people, or for services that can include older people, for example? So watch that sort of vagueness as well. Try and be as specific as you can. Is the question biased or misleading? The example that I've got there is around regular breast examinations. How often do you examine your breasts is a leading question. If you're doing any bias and you're having an expectation in that question that people should or do examine their breasts, so make sure that you cut that out. But you want to be open, so you would ask a more appropriate question is, what do you think about breast examinations, and get people talking about that. Have you assumed too much knowledge as well? For example, do you agree or disagree with the South Australian Generational Health Review? It's a little bit like a test. They might not know what that is. You'd have to check on all that first. And again, that's a closed question. Do you agree or disagree? It would be better to say, what if you knew that they knew about that particular review, what do you think about that review? Is less like a test. Don't be patronising or insulting. So tell me the ways that you have failed as a parent would be a fairly insulting question. Is the question intrusive? Very often anything to do with money is, unless the research project was specifically around somebody's income. When you're in the interview, what you need to be able to do is establish rapport. Very important for interviews where you are asking people about their values and beliefs and their experiences. And by rapport, I mean developing a sense of trust and ease, so being friendly and hospitable. Johnny Saldana always talks about taking along water. Other people set up cups of tea. If you're having, meeting somebody over a coffee, then you would buy that coffee for them. Communication and listening skills, I've talked already about that, knowing when to back off. So if somebody is looking very uncomfortable, you feel as if you've gone too far, then unlike somebody like Sarah Ferguson, she's one of our ABC journalists, she'd probably keep going. I would suggest backing off. You don't want to make somebody feel uncomfortable and respond to questions that they really don't want to. I've already talked about open questions, who, why, when, what, rather than closed questions. It's not that there's not a place for closed questions. As I said at the beginning and end of interviews, I'm usually using closed questions then, but the open questions are the important ones in the middle of a conversation. You can use prompts like, tell me about that, making sure that you're nodding encouragement, checking the way that you're sitting so that you're not closed off with your arms closed like that, perhaps mirroring the way that the other person is sitting as well. So copying what they do. Asking questions, you've got to think about sometimes the sequence and the types of questions. I guess I've covered questions enough there, but you want to make sure that you're covering everything on your interview guide but it doesn't matter if it goes out of sequence, I don't think, as long as you get back on track and cover what you need to cover. And then closing the interview, making sure that you thank the person, make sure that you are, if you've promised to do anything like send them a transcript, make sure that you do that as well. If you've offered to follow up on some information or you've been asked to, make sure that you do all of those things and check with the person about anything else that you need to do with them. Things to think about: how are you going to record the interview? And I've said a lot about making sure, not today, but think about the story I told last week about equipment not working. Make sure that your equipment is going to work. What will you do if the person doesn't want to be recorded in some way? You need to think about that as well. As I said, I find it very difficult to be handwriting notes and attending to somebody at the same time. But what I'm quite good at is writing notes extensively immediately afterwards. So make sure that you've got that, because not everybody will want to be recorded in any way. In terms of doing a content or a discourse analysis, that relates to how you're going to analyse the material. But I'm thinking there about do you need your interview material in electronic form? Once you've got a recording, sometimes these days you can use software like Dragon to automatically have that uploaded onto a computer. I still tend to get people to transcribe for me, but you can do it in some sort of electronic form. So once you've got it, so you've got an option there. If you want to just listen to the recording again and analyse from there, you're welcome to do it, but you can also transcribe in some way, hence that question about the discourse analysis. Do you want to analyse the material in detail? I find it easier to have it transcribed and in written form, and I would go backwards and forwards between listening to the transcript and reading it as well.
Now, if you're still with me at this point, I reckon you need some comic relief. So let's have a listen to this interview between English comedian and actor Rowan Atkinson and English singer-songwriter Elton John. It's a very funny interview, I think, because Rowan Atkinson does some things in the interviews that I'd prefer you don't.
Good evening and welcome to the National Theatre for this, the third in our series of informal conversations with major performers. It has been a very exciting season so far, which has encompassed such performing giants as Sir Ian McKellen, Dame Judi Dench, and of course, Christopher Biggins. But tonight we are to welcome a man who, although no giant, has nevertheless made a huge impression in his chosen field. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Elton John. Elton, do you mind if I call you Elton?
No, it's fine.
Good. Well, Elton. I'm sure the first question that everybody would like to ask you is this. Funny name, Elton. How did you come by it?
Well, I used to be in a band, and I wanted to become a singer in my own right, and I wanted to choose a name, and the saxophone player in the band was called Elton, so I chose that name.
Hmm? Did you ever consider John Elton?
No.
You didn't? Okay. Right, well, let's start with those early albums, then. One of which I believe was called simply Elton John.
Yes, that's correct.
And you didn't feel awkward with the name at all?
No.
You didn't feel that people might say, wait a minute, they mean John Elton. They've cocked up the record sleeve and printed the bloody name the wrong way around. You didn't think that?
No, I thought it sounded great, and, you know, I thought people would be more interested in the music rather than the name.
Hmm. Now, to the songs themselves. Many of the lyrics were, of course, written by Bernie Taupin.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Well, I'd like to talk about Bernie for a while, since obviously he's been an enormous influence on your career.
Yes, he has, yes.
Tell me, did you ever discuss changing his name? Because presumably Taupin Bernie would have been more consistent with your Elton John.
Look, do you want to talk about the old songs or not?
All right, the songs. The old songs. Your song is a classic, isn't it?
Yeah, it's quite popular, yes.
Well, there is a verse in that song in which, talking about the eyes of the person that the song is about, you sing, "Excuse me for asking, these things I do. You see, I've forgotten if they're green or they're blue."
Yes.
What I'd like to know is this. Is it this sort of chronic forgetfulness that led you to forget that Elton is not in fact a Christian name at all? It is a surname. And not a very attractive one at that.
Let's talk about something else, shall we? Forget the name.
All right, Mr. John. Let's talk about being a stage performer, should we? Tell me, do you ever watch other performers and get jealous?
I'm not sure I follow you there. I mean, jealous of what?
Well, for instance, Ben Elton.
Well, I don't have to do this, you know.
All right. Look, I'm sorry.
Go.
All right. Fair enough, moving on then. Many consider your masterpiece, of course, to be the album Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. And there is one song that people are particularly moved by called Candle in the Wind.
Yes, a lot of people seem to like that song.
Now, this song is in fact dedicated to Norma Jean Baker, who, of course, changed her name to Monroe Marilyn.
Marilyn Monroe.
My point exactly. Marilyn is a Christian name, so it comes first. Can't you see that? Are you word blind or something? I mean, it's...
I've had enough of this.
Well, all right, no, wait, please. I'm sorry. See, please, I'm sorry, it was my mistake. I'm sorry. There's only one more question to go. It won't take long, really. It won't take a moment. Sorry, there's only... I am... Please, sit down. One final question. You've obviously achieved enormous success over the years, but in fact, you didn't have a solo British #1 until this year, with a song called Sacrifice. Now, my big question is this. Surely, you wouldn't have had to wait so long for a #1 if it hadn't been for your stupid, pointless, bloody name!
I want to move on now to focus groups, which really are a group interview. So all of those skills and things that I've talked about before are relevant with focus groups as well. Focus groups you're probably already familiar with. They're used often by political parties, marketing companies, etc. Very flexible, low cost, quick to do. You can have a quick conversation with a group of people and you've got lots of ideas. It's also good with a group because often in a group, the group might bring up ideas that the researcher hasn't thought of at all. So that comes out of those group dynamics. You don't know where the conversation is going to go. Good things about it, they're all advantages. Disadvantages, the researcher absolutely has less control. You might find that the group takes over and you don't get much to say whatsoever. Less control, if that's an issue for you. You might not like to do focus groups. Group differences can cause conflict within the group, and that can make for an uncomfortable time for everyone. If you have one person dominating, obviously that can lead to a sense of conformity or groupthink, or people feeling uncomfortable in saying something that disagrees with that one dominant person. And they can be quite difficult to convene in terms of getting everybody together at a particular time. You do need, therefore, a skilled facilitator who is able to make sure that everybody gets a turn, that one person isn't dominating. And one way in which to do that is to make sure that everybody gets a turn by doing a round. So you go around the room and ask everybody their view. Or, so if you notice that somebody is fairly quiet, then you might want to ask that person a direct question if you think that they want to say something but haven't had an opportunity to do that. They're not an easy thing to do, however, they do have lots of advantages and are widely used as well. I haven't done an enormous number of focus groups, and recording them is interesting too. So you would want to think about video recording, audio recording again, somebody making notes. One of the things that we did in a focus group with young people who had been in the care of the state were no longer, and our interest was in whether anybody had talked to them about going on to university. So we convened, I worked with another group, so that's the we. There was me and another NGO or non-government organisation who specialises in working with young people who've been in state care. And we convened a couple of focus groups with young people, about 5 in each of those. And when it came to recording that, we had a very open way of doing that, in that the youth worker that I was working with took notes as I was also facilitating the conversation. So the two of us were working together, but the notes were on a big piece of paper, a butcher's paper, so that the people in the focus group could see the notes that we were taking as well. So there was nothing hidden, it was all out in front. So that's an option as well, that you can make sure that you make notes on a whiteboard or butcher's paper or around a room in some way, so that everybody else sees what's happening when it comes to notes.
Okay, so which one tasted better?
Steve.
Yeah, the guy.
With Lisa, I only tasted peanut butter and chocolate.
Lisa had just eaten a peanut butter cup.
But with Steve, I tasted something more. It was peanut butter and Snickers.
Peanut butter
You're
and
right.
Snickers.
Yeah, that's
Steve had just eaten Snickers peanut butter squared.
Steve was delicious.
Yeah. I'd love another taste.
Oh, certainly.
Participant observation is another, for some people, a hallmark of qualitative research. The aim there is really for researchers to kind of hang out with research participants, get to know them, stand in their shoes, by which I mean not just empathise, but really just understand their position, why they do things the way that they do. So it's an opportunity for researchers to spend time with people, to see things for themselves, ask questions, so that's where those interview skills will come into play again, and then record what is going on. And sometimes you'll do that recording as it's happening, and sometimes you'll do that recording in private and away from the particular event. The aim of participant observation is really to understand, get up close and personal with people, understand their motives and the perspectives of the participants in the research. Irving Goffman says that all behaviour is explicable when you see things from the perspective of the person you are trying to understand, and I absolutely agree with him on that. Once you understand their particular circumstances, what they're trying to do, why they're trying to do it, you get a handle on it. The aim is to participate in a social group as well as observe from a social science perspective. So you're kind of doing two lots of work there. You're hanging out with people doing the same thing that other people are doing, but you're also thinking about what people are doing from a social science or outsider perspective as well. So it's a double job that you've got going on. It is regarded as a method that has a high level of validity because you've got very first-hand insights into people's behaviour. So if you're doing overt participant observation, so that means that you're entirely open about the research project, about why you're there, how long you're going to be there, what the purpose is of your research project. So you're upfront about all of that. You've got ethics, you've got people signing consent forms, they've been informed, so they would have seen a participant information sheet, etc. So everything is open. You may need somebody who's a gatekeeper or a sponsor get in. Participant observation that I've done was an evaluation research project, which I've mentioned briefly in the ethics lecture. So what I was doing was evaluating 2 homes, what's called residential care facilities for young people who are living in the States. So they're under the age of 18, and the participants were between the ages of 12 and 17. I was very open about the entire project. The project had to be signed off by social workers who work for the state, as kind of representing the parents or the guardians of the children and young people. The children were informed about the project by the people working there. I also checked in with them. My keeper, I guess, was the organisation, who were absolutely a sponsor because they were employing me or providing money for me to do that evaluation. When you're doing something like that, where it's very open, it explains why you're there, keeping notes, recording conversations, if you're doing that with permission and asking questions. I didn't, as I said, I have difficulty taking notes and attending to conversations. So when I was doing this project, I didn't take any notes while I was there, and nor did I record any conversations, but I did ask lots of questions, and then I took my field notes, wrote my field notes immediately after spending time with the young people. Now, in terms of the hanging out with them, there was a range of activities that we did. I would usually go there and spend about an hour, maybe 2 hours, sometimes more than that, depending on the activities. And we would be having dinner together. I would be cooking, sometimes with young people, watching them play basketball, because I'm not very good at that myself. that was in one house with the boys, with the girls in the other house. We went shopping on one occasion as well, so I kind of tagged along, but it gave me a really good opportunity to ask questions of the young people, also of the youth workers, and also to observe the interactions between the youth workers and the young people. An advantage of this is that there's a concern with researchers kind of going native, so going over to the other side and losing any sense of distance or any sense of that objectivity, whether it's strong or not. That's where you continue to be a participant, but don't do that other work, cease to observe what's going on. So you're so involved in what's happening that you're not stepping back. And think about that. You could try doing that sort of experiment at home, having dinner with people and thinking, well, I'm going to be a researcher for this one, so I'll be a participant, but I'm also going to observe. You may find that it's actually really difficult to play both of those roles, that you do swing towards being a participant and forget about observing what's going on. Covert participation is ethically questionable, as you would have already read in the material, particularly about the Lord Humphreys case, but it can make it easier to gain access to groups who don't want to be observed. So you might want to hang around with a group of people, perhaps drug dealers, people involved in illegal activities, for example, won't want to have anybody involved there. One way to do that is do that kind of undercover. So that observer effect, how if somebody's watching you, you can change your behaviour. That's all avoided if somebody doesn't know that they're being watched. Absolutely an advantage. That question of the researcher going native, they might well join the group rather than continue to be an observer. Can't openly keep records at all. Obviously not just social scientists who do this sort of work. If you think about undercover cops or detectives, that's what they're doing. They're kind of doing covert participant observation. And also some journalists do this as well, where they go out and they hang out with a group for a while in order to expose particular groups. Because you can't openly keep records, because people wonder why you're taking notes, and it can change people's behaviour, you tend to keep a field diary, which is where you would write after the end of the day and keep up to date with what's been going on. Keep your notes as detailed as you possibly can, bearing in mind that you can't be taking them while you're hanging out with people. It still might be difficult to get access to people even in this situation, so who you are can make a difference. An obvious example is a man can't join a group of nuns, and in hierarchical groups you won't have access to all levels anyway. So at the very high level you might not have access, but you might have access at lower levels unless you are there for a while. And there are some limitations from doing participant observation, whether it is covert or overt. So remember that it is a small scale study that you're doing. It does take a long period of time. That might not be a problem, but if you're wanting to get a quick project done, then that's not going to suit you. It does take a while to do very detailed study. Researchers can't always blend in. That's a limitation as well. And you could think about gender, whether people know the lingo. Be able to blend in a group, you have to be able to have conversations with them in their own language and their own way of saying things. And so that's something to be learnt. Doesn't always work. There are skills involved here. There is that skill of being able to fit in, being able to pick up the local language, being able to communicate well and tactfully, making really, really careful observations, and separating out that role of participant and observer, which if you give that a go, you'll find is not necessarily an easy thing to do. We have to assume, this is one of the limitations, we have to assume when we're reading or hearing about participant observations that the researchers actually did, what they say, that they saw what they said. So that idea of integrity is really important there as well. One researcher cannot see or hear anything, so that's a limitation. Perhaps you might like to have more than one researcher working on a project, but definitely, one researcher just can't see anything. There will be things in the background that we don't know about because of that limitation.
If you decide that you really like the idea of doing covert participant observation, but you don't want a career in research, you might like to consider ASIO.
So I want to move on to talking about notes now, because this is important for your week 5 observational activity, which is important for your first piece of written work. Think about notes as a sample, where you're sampling again, and it's a sample of your observations. You can't record everything that you observe. Some things will just be out of your line of sight, and it'd be just too overwhelming. So the idea of taking notes is to make a note of your observations, so what you see happening, and then also your interpretation of why you think that happened. But it's really important in your notes to separate out what happened with your interpretation of what happened as well. So make sure that they're separated. So some people might do observer comments, for example. I see that in Johnny Saldana's work. He does OC, and then he has that typed up in italics. Some people might just highlight and put it in a different colour. So you're separating out what's going on, what's actually happening there, and why, your interpretation, why you think that's happening. So a group of people are skateboarding, so you're just observing that, and then there's some sort of conflict between two people, then that would be your observer comments about why you think there's suddenly some conflict between a couple of the young people skateboarding. You might want to prepare a layout of the space if you're very good at drawing. This is something I don't do very well. I definitely have some limitations with drawing and spatial views of things, but that might be a good idea for you to do a little bit of a plan. It gives you some focus. It means that when you draw people on the map, you can locate them very easily on that as well. Make sure that you're not trusting your memory. Take notes during the observation in terms of your activity. If you're able to do that, that's the best thing to do. If that's not possible, make sure that you're doing that straight away afterwards. As I said, when I've been doing participant observation, then I'm usually making my notes afterwards. It hasn't worked for me to be making notes at the particular time, for not just because I can't attend to everything, but because it would interrupt conversations and really be odd in the situation that I was in to be doing that. So what I would do is get home from spending the time with the young people, and then I would write furiously for as long as it took until that thing about a saturation again, whereas I felt empty, as if I'd written everything that I needed to write. Perhaps something might come to me later on, and then I would add that as well. So don't trust your memory. Do it as quickly as possible, because the longer gap between taking the notes and the observation, the more you're likely to forget. If you are taking notes doing an observation, then make sure that you're discreet. People absolutely behave differently if they think they're under surveillance. And I know that when I've been working with students in the past, they've commented that people have asked them why they're making notes and looking at them all the time. So what we learnt was the students weren't particularly discreet. They were looking for too long, and all of that's very interesting from a sociological perspective as well, because we're talking about sort of social rules there about how long it is okay to be looking at somebody for. And that people feel very uncomfortable if, and I certainly know that I do, I don't want to be under surveillance. So you might behave in a way that's more outrageous or more conforming. Good idea to take notes in stages, so doing it very rapidly at the beginning, and then as soon as you can, getting to the point of making more detailed notes, filling in some of that. So sketchy at the beginning, more detailed later on. Is it worth it to write out all the detail? Absolutely yes. And in fact, what we're wanting from your week 5 observational activity and then to come forward into your report is as much detail as possible. You can't always be sure of what's important, and that's why it's important to record everything. And if your field notes, and a point to remember that your field notes will look very, very different to your final report, so that's usual. So even if you don't use all of that material in the way that you take it, for your report, it's still important in terms of background. A final point I want to make is about reflexivity, thinking about what we're doing as we're doing it. Reflexive researcher really is somebody who's aware of the theoretical assumptions that they're making and their own assumptions and how they can shape and limit the research. And I guess we've talked a bit about that earlier on. Important to be thinking about that. Also be very aware of how the research is being conducted, the methods that are being used and the impact of those on participants. And be critical about your own self-involvement as well, the way that you implicitly or explicitly shape the research. And I've said that in terms of how you might be seen by participants, that can present a barrier, or not. It could be a really good thing. So having a young person talking to young people might be a really good thing, for example, but also the possible effects of those power relationships, gender, age, class and status as well. It's a good idea to be thinking about all of that. And then I wanted to just finish up with this fabulous, well, what I think is a fabulous quote by Australian sociologist Raewyn Connell. Kind of for me sums up what it is when we're doing research. And she says, with social know-how and socially situated knowledges, one is swimming in the social surf. With reflective knowledge of society, one is standing back on the shore, taking a certain distance from the water and considering how the surf is breaking. And this allows for analysis and critique. Yet it is no less social than the other forms of knowledge. So when you're thinking about your research methods and doing your observation activity, you're taking that point of stepping back on the shore a little bit, but you are still social, still a social activity, and that's part of the reflexivity to think about that, all of your assumptions, what you might be taking into that research and how you might be judging the situation. That's all for today, and thanks for listening.